A quick little caveat here. So we don't spend a lot of our time designing the portfolio to take advantage of a specific big picture macro event, but Mark, myself and the team spend a lot of time preparing the portfolio for risks, managing risk, protecting the downside in the portfolio. And the biggest near-term risk in financial markets today is the US elections. Whether you like it or not, it's happening, it's a few weeks away. I know a lot of us switch off when we talk about US politics and US culture wars, and I wish I could switch off a lot of the time. That's what I'm talking about. I know exactly, the big market-moving event. But unfortunately, the outcomes in these elections really have the potential to move markets, and for investors, especially professional investors like Mark and myself, we have to pay a lot of attention. I want to be very clear up front. I've been giving this speech now for 2 weeks, and I've sat in rooms that were ardently anti-Trump and ardently pro-Trump. I haven't actually sat in the room that was pro-Kamala yet. It's very much pro-anti-Trump. Nothing about what I'm going to say today is an endorsement or a criticism of any politician. That's not my job in life. Instead, what I'm trying to do is provide a very narrow analysis of the election's impact on financial markets. That's what I'm concerned about. I'm not endorsing anyone. I'm not criticising anyone. Just to lay the groundwork, I mean, the things that we will have seen a lot in the paper, since Kamala Harris has come along, taken the presidential nominee from Biden, the Democrats have enjoyed a really big bounce in the polls, and she's certainly ahead by a few percent nationally. We see a lot of that in the press. In the real world, that doesn't make any difference. So for better or worse, under the kind of archaic rules of the US Constitution, the Republican Party enjoys a big structural advantage over the Democrats. It's not a popular vote contest. The vote is decided by this electoral college vote system. And what that means in practice for this election, there are just 7 swing states in the US that will determine the outcome. 3 in the Sunshine Belt, 4 in the Rust Belt. And as best as we can tell, the polling in those states is still neck and neck. It is very much a coin toss. The more important thing, I'll just sort of run through the big picture. I guess the thing that I think is much more important when thinking about financial markets and the implications of these elections. The presidential race takes all the oxygen out of the room. It's what gets all the attention. The thing that I think investors need to be focused on are the other 2 races taking place. So there's also votes taking place for the House, the US's lower house of Parliament, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. In the House, like the White House race, as best we can tell, g'day Dominic, as best we can tell, it looks like a coin toss. It's 50-50. The Democrats are ever so slightly ahead in the polls. The Republicans currently control the House, as you can see on this lovely slide here. The Senate race is the one you need to pay attention to. And if you don't remember anything else from today, this is the point that I'd ask you to leave with. The outcome in the Senate looks very, very different. US senators serve 6-year terms, and they're staggered terms. So every 2 years, a third of the 100 seats of the Senate come up for re-election. And in this election cycle, the Democrats have been dealt a really tough hand. Of the 34 seats that are getting run, because this is the US, only 8 are actually contestable. All the other seats, it's a complete foregone conclusion. It's a very partisan country. It's very clear who's going to win in Texas, who's going to win in California. These 8 states will determine the makeup of the Senate. The problem that the Democrats have is all 8 are currently controlled by the Democrats. So there's really only one way to go. Or to say it another way, the Republicans only need to win 2 of 8 to flip control of the Senate. And the problem that they face, the Democrats, is that a lot of these races in states that lean very heavily Republican, Montana, Ohio, West Virginia. The bookies, the bookmakers have had the probability of the Republicans winning the Senate at well over 70% for well over a year now, and that probability hasn't budged. It's stayed very constant for a long period of time. So whatever your view on politics is, the clear-eyed point that we have to take away from what we can see today is it's very likely the Republicans will take control of the Senate next year. And that has a we're not there yet. That has a huge bearing on
Where do you want to go?
just back to the states. That has a huge bearing on the presidential race itself. So under the US Constitution, one of the key functions of the Senate is to act as a check on the executive powers of the presidency. So the whole US system is designed around checks and balances. One of the key functions of the Senate is to act as a check on the powers of the president. They didn't want a king, they wanted someone held accountable. In practice, what that means is that a hostile Senate can make a president's life absolutely miserable. The Senate approves all the cabinet posts, all the judges, all the senior officials appointed throughout the government bureaucracy. And if you have a hostile Senate, they can obviously block any laws that the president wants to pass, and more importantly, make their life a bit of a living hell. So what that means, that creates a big problem for any Harris presidency. If she wins the nominee, she wins the election, she's almost certainly going to face a hostile US Republican Senate. And, you know, in a more optimistic time, you might say divided government's a good thing, that it forces everyone to work together in the centre. I don't think any of us think we're at that time in the US today. It's very easy to see us falling into the old grind where the Republicans block anything of substance she wants to do, just to be able to say at the end of her term she didn't achieve anything. So for better or worse, a Harris presidency probably means nothing changes. No laws get passed. We probably see a lot of pantomime, a lot of theatre, a lot of, you know, bitter fights, but no laws and nothing actually changing in Congress. If you flip the tables, however, and you give Trump the presidency with control of the Senate, things can actually change. Former President Trump's made three big campaign promises: deregulate the economy, cut the red tape, cut taxes, and raise tariffs. On that, we're going to run through all three later on in the presentation, but on that first one, he can do that unilaterally with control of the Senate. He doesn't need to pass any laws. So if we flip a coin and Trump wins with control of the Senate, big changes are coming in the US economy and in US government. And of course, the Republicans currently control the lower house. It's very conceivable that he gets all three branches of government, in which case he'd also be going after tax cuts. Again, would really change the makeup of the US economy. And I was reading a fascinating article the other day that was highlighting if Trump was to become president with all three branches of government, he'd probably be one of the most powerful presidents in history. 6 of the 9 High Court justices have been appointed by Republicans recently, with three branches of government under control. The Republican Party really could bring some of their kind of more aggressive policies to bear, I guess, in terms of changing the makeup of the US economy. Again, I'm not passing comment. What I would say is most, but not all, economists think that most of Trump's policies would harm the US economy in the long run. But in the short run, and this is something we'll come back to, they would be very stimulative. Inflationary, they probably boost markets a lot. I guess one of the things I want to highlight is you probably don't want to stand in the way of that if you're a dispassionate investor. So point one, don't focus on the US presidential race, focus on the US Senate race. Point two, and this is a little depressing, but I'll try and get through it in the most cheery way I can. What we need to understand is whoever wins the presidential vote, it's going to be incredibly close. It will be an incredibly close election. The outcome is probably not going to be known for a little while. And the thing that we need to remember is that in 2020, Trump claimed that he only lost due to Democrat cheating. Now, whether you believe that's true or not is kind of irrelevant. That idea has become Republican orthodoxy for the last 4 years. Something like 1 in 3 Americans believes Biden is an illegitimate president. That's kind of an astounding statistic. That means tens and tens and tens of millions of Americans believe that Biden won through cheating today. What a lot of people don't realise, I think, is that since 2020, the Republican Party's put a huge effort into legitimising that claim of cheating. There's currently 100 different lawsuits being fought all over the country contesting election rules and who's allowed to vote in the election itself. And why they're being so successful with this is, again, I'll keep saying for better or worse. For better or worse, the electoral system in the US is designed by the states. Each state writes its own laws on how you conduct an election, its own rules on how you determine the winner of that election. Most of these rules were written hundreds of years ago, and in some of the states particularly, they're not very well drafted. So that ambiguity provides a great amount of wiggle room for an aggressive Republican lawyer to make some claims. These lawsuits are basically focused on two things. Firstly, to lay the groundwork to contest the elections if they're close and they don't go the Republicans' way. And then secondly, very much more nativist, is just to remove people from the electoral roll. And to give you a sense of the scale of this, in Arizona, there's a big fight going on at the moment where the Republican Party is trying to remove 500,000 people, 500,000 people from the Arizona electoral roll for this November vote. If you think about how close this election is going to be, 500,000 people will certainly make quite a big difference. More broadly, this claim that the Democrats can only win by cheating has created a lot of bad blood. Polling workers are getting issued with panic buttons on the day of the vote. There's dozens of death threats. I read this other kind of dispiriting article the other day saying one of the biggest challenges they have for the vote is getting people to do the job. Most of these are volunteer jobs. Many of the volunteers have said they're not coming this time. It's too scary. They don't want to be involved in it. And one of the big challenges they'll face on the day is just not having enough people to do the counting, which certainly creates a lot of the ambiguity that the more sinister people need to claim malfeasance. I'll say, look, I'm not a conspiracy nut. I do think even if we have a contested election, the system of checks and balances will hold. But the thing that I'm thinking about, that Mark and I are planning the portfolio around, is the potential for a lot of uncertainty and a lot of volatility in markets between November and January. So if Trump loses by a fine margin, it's almost certain they'll be contested. And of course, last time we had that situation, we had the Capitol Hill riots in the US. Another slightly depressing statistic, 1 in 5 American adults tell pollsters they're open to the idea of violence for political ends. Now, I hope most of them don't mean that, but gosh, there's a lot of people and a lot of guns. You don't need many of them to mean that for something scary to happen. You know, we've already had 3 assassination attempts on Donald Trump. So there's always the tail risk that something goes a little bit pear-shaped. Pulling that slightly depressing narrative all together, I guess the way I'd characterise it is, if Harris wins, even if you think she's the right choice for America, if Harris wins, it looks to be a bit of a hospital pass. In the short term, she's almost certainly going to face a contested election, a nasty fight for 2 or 3 months. And then in the medium term, she's going to face a very hostile Republican Senate that probably can and will block anything of substance she wants to get done. It's going to be a bit of a lame duck presidency. She'll be the first president in 30 years to enter office without control of Parliament, to enter office without the ability to actually pass any laws. In contrast, rightly or wrongly, a Trump victory probably means a bit of a sugar rush for markets, and there's 2 scenarios we'll touch on in a minute. The first one I want to talk about is this idea of deregulating the economy, and it sounds a bit wonkish, a bit sort of like an economic wonk, but it's quite meaningful. So he's got 3 big promises at the moment: deregulate the economy, cut taxes, and raise tariffs. On the deregulation point, I want to double click on that because, as I was saying, with control of the Senate, he can do it unilaterally. He doesn't need to pass any laws. He made the same claims, the same promises in 2016 when he ran for office, and he largely delivered on them. What we can see here, thanks Emma, is a well-followed indice in the US. This is small business optimism in the US economy. And you can see pre-Trump and then how it skyrocketed when Trump was elected as president. Now, it stayed there for, you're jumping ahead a little bit, but that's cool. If it stayed there for quite a while, and this here is COVID. During that three and a half years before COVID came, and obviously COVID's not his fault, no matter how old we think he is, in that 3.5 years, the US economy went gangbusters. GDP was some of the strongest growth in recent time. The US share market rallied by 50% in that 3-year period. So whatever you think of Trump, he's very good at getting the economy going, even if, you know, potentially that maybe stores up bigger problems for the long run. Taking that all together, kind of dispassionately looking at running the portfolio, you can see here where business optimism's been under Biden, just to get a contrast. Taking that all together, if we say there's a high probability the Republicans are going to control the Senate, we take that as given, then there's really 3 scenarios that we're preparing ourselves for. The first one, 50% chance Harris wins the presidency and can't do much. Divided government, a lot of pantomime, a lot of shouting and screaming. That's not terrible. We have divided government today. The US economy is still growing very fast. In most rich countries would be delighted to be growing as fast as the US economy. Unemployment's low. The US share market's been doing very, very well. So the status quo, with a lot of shouting and screaming, is actually not a terrible place for investors. Then there's maybe a 25% chance that Trump wins with control of the Senate. And if we do have that, I think it'll be modestly positive to markets. This backdrop here of deregulation, releasing animal spirits, I think could really get the economy going to some degree. And then finally, last scenario, Trump wins with control of the upper house and the lower house. And if that's the case, there's a real chance it's game on. He's determined to cut taxes, really stimulate the economy, be very inflationary, and we certainly wouldn't want to be short the market at a time when Trump's in power with his hand on all parts of government trying to rev the economy up. So that's the way we're looking at it. Again, we're not passing political judgment on any parts of it, but in any sort of particular outcome. But in terms of managing the risk and positioning ourselves and, I guess, talking to investors, those are the 3 scenarios we think people need to have in mind.
So we don't have to do any more money until February.
Yeah, well, you might have missed the rally by then. You might want to give it to me on the 4th of November. Yeah, get a...
That's an optimism index, which is not the same as how the economy actually performed, is it?
It's not, no. So it just measures small business optimism, which is like one of those sentiment figures that people watch quite closely. And it's important in the sense that small business employs something like half of the economy. It's most of startups. It's where a lot of the excitement happens. Not all, but a lot. And it's generally a pretty good proxy for the potential of an economy. So when business optimism is low, that's generally a bit of a harbinger for bad growth. And when it's high, and I don't have the figures to mind, but I think roughly during that time, the US economy was growing at sort of 3.5% per annum, incredibly fast. Now,
You would look at the optimism index alongside what the economy is doing, but then more importantly, what the share market is doing. And I think obviously it's really important that you guys look at the probabilities, and you have looked at a scenario where Kamala wins with the Senate as well.
yes.
Because of course that is,
nothing's guaranteed.
everything is a probability, right? But interestingly, in terms of the US, and just to kind of put it into perspective of why it's so crucial in this day and age for global financial markets, when I first came into financial markets in like 2000, the mantra was always that the US kind of made up 50% of global markets. The US has been so incredibly strong over the last decade in particular, that it now makes up 65% of global financial markets. And when you consider that massive change...
And that's happened at the same time China's exploded. So despite China, the US has still taken an enormous amount of market share.
Exactly. So it's looking at this optimism, this is the best thing we have in terms of small businesses and getting a finger on the pulse, but obviously you would need to look at those alongside what are financial markets doing, what is the economy doing, and it is going gangbusters.
Yeah. Growth during that time was about 3.5%, which is incredibly strong for a big old economy like the US. The economist in me worries that you're mortgaging the future to a degree, you're spending more than you bring in, you're racking up the big debt, but in the near term, these things can be very inflationary. We'll have time for more questions at the end, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're not passing Miles isn't passing a judgment on whether these policies are responsible. I mean, I think Trump wants to spend $8 billion, $8 trillion, sorry. Kamala wants to spend $4 trillion. Is that responsible in the long term? Probably not. But we're looking really at the short term and what that might mean for the portfolio.